He counted the mail-order bride's letters twice before the train ever came, as if reading Clara Foss's careful, looping hand a second time might change what stepped off the platform. Briggs Tanner stood at the Two Pines depot in his one good coat, hat turned over and over in his hands, and watched the passenger car empty of a drummer, two cattle buyers, and a woman who was most certainly not the soft-voiced girl from the letters. She came down the iron steps like she was daring them to give under her, a battered trunk gripped in one hand and a hatpin visible at her collar, as if she expected to need it for something other than her hat. Her eyes found him across the platform, grey, quick, unsentimental, and took his measure the way a buyer looks over a horse he suspects has been fed grain to fatten it before the sale. "You're Tanner," she said. It was not a question. "I sent for Clara Foss." "You got Adeline Foss instead." She set the trunk down with a thud that suggested it held bricks rather than a trousseau. "Clara's married. 3 weeks passed to the Barlow boy who's loved her since they were children and finally found the nerve to say so. She wrote you a letter explaining it." "I expect it's coming on a slower train than I was." Briggs looked at the empty platform, at the depot agent pretending not to listen, at this woman who had apparently decided the arrangement would go forward regardless of who arrived to fill it. "And you came in her place because our father left debts, Mr. Tanner, and part of those debts was a promise made to you. And Foss women keep their promises even when the men who made them are dead and can't be shamed into keeping their own word." She said it flat, without asking for pity. "The way a person states the price of flour. I'm 2 years older than Clara. I don't sew as fine as she does. I have opinions I don't keep to myself, and I can read a ledger better than most bankers. If that's not the bargain you wanted, put me back on the train. I'll manage. I always have." He had wanted gentle. He had written, in his letter to the matrimonial paper, that he wanted a wife who was biddable and soft-spoken, because his own house had gone hard and silent since his mother died, and he did not think he had patience left for anything sharp. He looked at Adeline Foss's set jaw and her hatpin and thought that he had gotten, instead, a woman built like a closed fist. "There's a ranch 2 hours from here," he said finally. "Room enough. I won't put a woman back on a train with nowhere to go, whatever else I do or don't do. But I make no promises past supper. I never asked you to make any." Adeline picked up her own trunk before he could reach for it, hefting it onto her hip like she'd carried heavier. "Lead on, Mr. Tanner. I've come a long way, and I'd rather see the place than stand discussing it on a platform." The depot agent, who had clearly been enjoying the exchange far too much to pretend otherwise any longer, let out a low whistle as they walked off, and Briggs heard him mutter something to the ticket clerk about the Tanner place getting more interesting than it had been in years. He did not disagree. The ride out was quiet except for the wagon wheels and the wind coming through the grass, and Briggs used the silence to look sideways at her more than once, trying to reconcile the woman beside him with the wife he had pictured through a winter's worth of letters. She sat straight-backed, watching the country pass. The dry creek, the fence line he'd mended twice that spring, the cattle scattered thin across land that hadn't seen good rain in a year, and said nothing at all until they crested the last rise and his house came into view. Grey-boarded and sagging at one corner of the porch. "That porch step is rotted through," she said. "You'll break your neck on it before Christmas, and then where will your ranch be?" "Been meaning to fix it." "Meaning to isn't fixing." She said it without malice, the way she seemed to say everything. As a fact laid on the table, take it or leave it. Briggs found himself almost smiling, which surprised him more than her sharp tongue had. He had not smiled easily in the 2 years since his mother passed and the house had gone quiet around him. He gave her the spare room, the one that had been his mother's, and told her supper was whatever she could make of the larder, because he'd been living on beans and his own poor cooking since his housekeeper had married off the year before and moved to Cheyenne. Adeline looked in the larder, looked at him, and said the situation was worse than the porch step, and that was the last soft thing she said to him for 3 days running. She did not sew fine, as promised, but she mended the porch step herself with a borrowed hammer before he'd found the hour to do it, and when he came in from the far pasture to find it solid under his boot, he stood there a long moment feeling something in his chest that he could not name and did not entirely trust. His 2 hired hands, Dell and young Tommy Ruiz, took to watching her from a careful distance those first days, the way men watch weather they can't quite predict, uncertain whether the new Mrs. Tanner-to-be was going to run the household kindly or run it like a drill sergeant. By the end of the first week she had settled it herself, feeding them both a supper so much better than Briggs's beans that Dell declared, loudly and to no one in particular, that he didn't care one way or another what had happened with the sister business. So long as it kept turning out chicken and dumplings on a Sunday. Cyrus Pruitt rode over on the fourth day, ostensibly to welcome the new Mrs. Tanner, though everyone in the county knew Pruitt rode nowhere without a reason attached to his own gain. He owned the spread bordering Briggs' land to the east, and he had wanted the water rights running through Tanner ground for 2 years, ever since his own creek had started running thin in the dry seasons. "Heard you sent for a gentle little bride and got yourself a spinster instead," Pruitt said, loud enough to carry to the porch where Adeline stood with a basket of wash. "Whole town's talking, Briggs. Prudence Hale said she'd have made you a finer wife, and no mix-up about it needed." "Prudence Hale is welcome to say what she pleases," Briggs said, low. "She's saying it to anyone who'll listen. Says this one's too old, too plain-spoken, probably too proud to keep a house properly. Says you ought to send her back and do the thing right, the way it was meant to be done." Pruitt smiled the way he always did when he was laying groundwork, easy and unhurried, a man who had never in his life been in a hurry to say the thing he actually meant. "Course, if a man found himself embarrassed by his own arrangement, and wanted quiet money for his water rights instead of a wife nobody rightly chose, I'd still be glad to talk business, neighborly as ever. My water rights aren't for sale, Cyrus. Never have been, not when you asked 2 years back and not now. Man's circumstances change." Pruitt tipped his hat toward the porch, toward Adeline, who had gone very still with the wash basket on her hip. "Ma'am, welcome to the district. Hope it suits you better than it seems to be suiting the neighbor's opinion of it." She did not answer him. She watched him ride off with her jaw set hard enough that Briggs half expected to hear her teeth grind, and when Pruitt was well down the road she said, "That man wants your water and he means to use gossip and shame to get it cheap, since he can't get it honest. You ought to know that plain, since you seem the sort who needs things said plain rather than hinted at." "I know Cyrus Pruitt," Briggs said. 20 years since we were boys together, if you can believe it. Then you know he won't stop at gossip." She hefted the basket and went back to the line. And Briggs stood watching hang wet linen with sharp, efficient movements, thinking that Prudence Hale, gentle and soft-spoken as she was reputed to be, had never once in 3 years of knowing him warned him about anything at all, nor troubled herself to notice when his fences needed mending or his accounts wanted checking. Adeline had not expected to like the ranch. She had come west prepared only to endure it, to keep a promise, pay a debt of honor her father's cowardice had left behind him, and make the best of a stranger's house until either the arrangement failed outright, or she found some way to bear it for the rest of her days. She had not expected the particular quiet of the land at dusk, gold going to violet over the grass, nor the way Briggs Tanner, for all his gruffness, thanked her for meals in a voice that sounded like he meant it, and not like a man performing manners he didn't feel. Nor the way he'd gone still and careful with her the morning after Pruitt's visit, watching her like a man recalculating a sum he'd gotten wrong the first time and was in no hurry to get wrong again. She had certainly not expected Prudence Hale to call on her directly, a week later. All yellow curls and honeyed voice, ostensibly to bring a pie and welcome the new bride to the district, though the timing, 3 days after the church social, where half the county had watched Adeline with open curiosity, murmuring behind gloved hands about the sis who'd come instead, told its own story plainly enough. "It must be so hard," Prudence said, setting the pie on the table with the delicacy of a woman placing a trap. "Coming all this way in your sister's place. People do talk, you know, and I heard some unkind things said after service Sunday. I only mention it because I'd want someone to tell me plainly, if it were me standing in your shoes." "How kind of you," Adeline said, "to want for me what you'd clearly want for yourself, Miss Hale." Prudence's smile thinned at the edges. "Briggs and I have known each other since we were children. Everyone in the district assumed, before he ever sent that advertisement off to the matrimonial paper, that we'd simply marry when he was ready to. I don't say it to wound you. I say it because a woman ought to know where she stands, and not go on fooling herself about a house that was never truly meant for her. I know exactly where I stand, Miss Hale. On his land, in his mother's old room, mending his porch step because he hadn't gotten to it in 2 years of trying. I don't need you to draw me a map of a house I'm already living in. Adeline poured coffee she had not been asked to pour and set it down in front of her with a click that carried more than politeness. But I'll tell you where you stand, since you're so generous with maps of your own making. You rode out here to look me over and decide whether I was worth the trouble of removing. I'd say by the look on your face, you've already decided I am, and that troubles you more than any gossip about a sister swap. Prudence left without touching her own pie, and Briggs, coming in from the barn in time to see her go, found Adeline scrubbing the coffee pot with more force than the task required. Prudence Hale doesn't usually leave a house before she's finished her business, he observed, hanging his hat on the peg. I finished it for her. He almost laughed. He caught himself doing it more often now, some private amusement tugging at his mouth before he could smooth it fully away. And he did not examine too closely why a woman who was nothing at all like what he'd asked for kept surprising that reaction out of him after 2 years of a house too quiet for laughing. She's not a bad person, he said, just used to getting what she sets her mind to, and unused to being told no. Then it'll be educational for her, meeting me. He did laugh then, once short and rusty, like the sound hadn't been used in a long while and had to be dusted off before it worked properly. Adeline looked up sharply, startled, and for a moment something passed between them that neither one named, a kind of recognition, unlooked for, that made the kitchen feel smaller and warmer than a kitchen with a broken hinge on its stove door had any right to feel. The weeks that followed were not soft, but they built something between them all the same. Adeline burned 2 suppers learning his stove's particular temper, and told him plainly that his cattle looked thin and his hired hands looked idle. Opinions he had not solicited and did not entirely appreciate at first, though he found, turning the words over in his own mind at night, that she was right about both. She reorganized his accounts without asking permission and discovered he'd been overpaying the feed merchant in town for the better part of a year, because he hadn't the patience to check a column of figures twice. A discovery that saved him more money in an afternoon than he'd have found in a season of careful ranching. She did not soften her voice for him, did not perform the gentleness Clara's letters had promised, and yet she rose before him every morning to have coffee ready, and mended his shirts without being asked, and once, when he came in soaked through from a spring storm that had caught him repairing a washed-out fence line, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders with hands that lingered a moment longer than duty required before she caught herself and stepped back, color rising in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the cold. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know what I have to do and what I choose to do, Mr. Tanner. Learn the difference, and you'll understand me a good deal better than the rest of this county seems able to." She turned back to the stove before he could see whatever was on her face, and Briggs stood dripping in his own kitchen, understanding for the first time since the letters had begun that he had never wanted gentle at all. He had wanted to be seen clearly and stayed with anyway, by someone who wouldn't flinch from the truth of him. Adeline Foss had done that without once being asked, and had done it in the space of a few short weeks that felt, somehow, longer and richer than the 2 lonely years before them. He began without deciding to, watching for her in the evenings, for the particular set of her shoulders when she was tired but wouldn't say so, for the rare unguarded laugh she gave when one of the barn cats knocked his hat clean off its peg, for the way she stood at the window some nights with her arms crossed, looking east toward the family she'd left behind to keep a dead man's promise she'd never asked to inherit. He began to think that the arrangement he had entered as a plain business matter had turned, somewhere in the mending and the ledgers and the burnt suppers and the blanket around his shoulders, into something he did not want to lose, and the thought unsettled him more than Pruitt's threats or Prudence's gossip ever had. Pruitt did not wait for the autumn roundup to make his move. He made it during it, which was worse. Briggs' hands were out on the range gathering the herd for the drive to the rail pens at 2 Pines, half the outfit strung thin across 3 miles of grass, when Adeline, riding out with the noon meal in a wagon as she'd taken to doing every day of the gather, smelled smoke on the wind before anyone else did. It came up fast along the dry creek bed that bordered Pruitt's land, too fast, too deliberate for a stray spark from a careless pipe, catching the parched grass and running hard toward the herd and the cottonwood stand where half of Briggs' cattle had bunched to escape the heat of the day. Adeline did not wait to confirm her own suspicion of how the fire had started, nor whose hand might have struck the match. She hauled the wagon team around, whipped them toward the nearest rider, and began shouting before she'd even fully reached him. "Fire on the creek! It's running for the herd, and running fast." The camp exploded into motion. Briggs came up out of the grass on his horse at a dead run, saw the smoke rolling black and fast toward 300 head of cattle bunched with no clear way around the flame, and felt his stomach drop through the earth beneath him. The herd panicked into a stampede toward the rimrock to the north. Men would go down under hooves in the dark and the smoke. If they didn't move the cattle at all, they'd lose the whole gather to the fire, and likely the season's income and the ranch's slim margin along with it. Break them east. Toward the river crossing, he shouted, but even as he said it he knew the numbers were wrong, not enough hands, the fire coming too fast, and somewhere in the rolling smoke young Tommy Ruiz, 17 years old and green as spring grass, had gotten his horse tangled in brush at the worst possible angle to the advancing flame front. Adeline saw the boy down before Briggs did. She turned the wagon team without a second's hesitation, drove it hard along the creek bank toward where Tommy struggled with a rearing, panicked horse and a wall of smoke closing the distance behind him fast, and threw herself down off the seat before the wagon had fully stopped rolling. "Cut him loose, or you'll both burn where you stand," she shouted, already at the horse's head, one hand clamped hard over its nose to keep it from bolting while she worked the boy's caught stirrup free with the other. Her skirts already scorched at the hem from sparks riding the wind ahead of the main fire. Tommy came loose and half fell against her. She shoved him bodily toward the wagon bed, turned, and slapped the horse hard on the flank to send it running clear before the smoke rolled fully over the spot where they'd stood a breath earlier. Briggs reached them in the same instant, flinging himself off his own mount, hauling both Adeline and the boy up into his saddle and his own arms in a single desperate motion that would leave bruises on all three of them by morning. He got them clear of the creek bank as the fire jumped dry stand of brush behind them with a roar like a freight train coming through open country, and for one endless, roaring moment the world was smoke and heat and the frantic bawling of cattle. And Briggs held Adeline against his chest with an arm gone iron hard, not from strength, but from the sheer refusal of anything in this world to take her from him now that he finally understood what she was. They broke the herd east along the river in the end, losing a dozen head to the flame and none at all to panic, thanks to hands who'd had one more crucial minute to organize, because Adeline had bought it for them at the creek with her own 2 hands and her own steady nerve. By the time the fire burned itself out against the wet river bottom, the sky had gone the color of a bruise and half the county had ridden out to help, drawn by the column of smoke, including, grim-faced and furious in a way that told its own story before he ever opened his mouth, the sheriff, who took one look at the burn pattern along the dry creek and rode straight for Pruitt's land without waiting to be asked twice. It was full dark before Briggs found Adeline again, sitting on the tailgate of the supply wagon with soot streaked across her face and Tommy Ruiz's stammered, tearful gratitude still ringing in her ears, her hands shaking now that there was nothing left to hold steady against. "You could have been killed," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw with everything he hadn't let himself feel while the fire was still moving and there had been no room left for fear. So could the boy. "I wasn't going to stand in a wagon and watch him burn for want of someone willing to move." She looked up at him, soot-streaked and unflinching even now, and something in her voice cracked despite her best effort to hold it steady. "I know I'm not what you sent for, Briggs. I know I'm not soft, I don't so fine. I say things a gentler woman would have the good sense to keep to herself. If you want to write another advertisement, I'll understand it, and I'll go without making a scene of it." He crossed the space between them before she finished the sentence and took her face in both hands, gentle in a way his hard-worked hands rarely were with anything at all. "I sent for a stranger's idea of a wife because I didn't rightly know what I actually needed," he said. "I needed someone who'd run a wagon straight into a fire for a boy she'd known 3 weeks and owed nothing to." I needed someone who'd tell me the truth about my own cattle and my own accounts and my own foolish pride, because nobody else around here has bothered to in years, not even the ones who claim to love me. I don't want Clara, Adeline. I never truly did, not really. Not once. I'd met you standing on that platform with your hat pin and your chin up like you were daring the whole world to try you. I want the woman who came instead of her. I came to keep a promise, she said, but her voice had gone unsteady, all its careful flatness burned clean away with the smoke. Then make a new one, Briggs said. Marry me because you choose it, not because your father owed a debt he never should have made in your name. Stay because you want to, not because you've nowhere else on this earth to go. I'll ask you properly, with a ring and a preacher and Prudence Hale scowling the second pew if she likes it or not. But I need to know now whether there's a chance in this world you'd say yes to a man fool enough to ask twice. Adeline Foss, who had faced down a train platform full of strangers and a scheming neighbor and a wall of prairie fire without her voice once shaking, found that it shook now, answering him. I came here sharp-tongued and unwanted, half certain you'd send me back on the next train the moment you got a proper look at me, she said. If you're fool enough to want me anyway, Briggs Tanner, then yes, I'll stay. Not for a promise made before I was ever born to keep it. For the one I'm making now of my own free will, with my whole heart behind it. He kissed her there in the ash and starlight with the smell of smoke still clinging to both of them, and behind them the exhausted, grateful hands of the outfits sent up a ragged cheer that carried clear across the water to the river. Pruitt left the county before the sheriff had even finished his investigation. His water rights scheme burned up along with a fair portion of his own fence line, and every last scrap of his credibility, and Prudence Hale, to her lasting credit, sent a plain and gracious note of congratulation when the wedding was announced in the county paper, admitting in careful handwriting that she had misjudged a woman she'd been too quick to take for a rival before ever giving her the chance to be a friend. They were married in October, in the little church at Two Pines, with the mended porch steps standing solid under both their boots when they came home that night as husband and wife at last. Briggs told her once, years later, with their own children grown enough to roll their eyes at the story told again at the supper table for the 100th time, that he had prayed on that platform for a gentle bride, and been granted instead the one thing gentle could never in a lifetime have given him. A woman who ran toward the fire instead of away from it, who mended what was broken before anyone thought to ask her, and who had chosen him in the end freely and entirely, with her whole unflinching heart.